I trip up over that word a lot. Like, it's hard for me to say normal. Each person has these like really incredible abnormalities. Normal needs to be disconnected or disassociated with good.
I'm Stephen Bradshaw, and this is Snowball Psychology. Neha, thank you for coming onto this podcast.
Yeah, I'm really happy to be here.
Great. So we work together at a treatment center for teens where you still work on mental health and particularly OCD. And maybe a good place to start is just giving people a quick Cliff Notes version of how you got to this point, maybe emphasizing how you got onto this path of being a therapist. What came together for you for that to happen?
Yeah. I always, at this point in my career, I feel like I've had to say this narrative so many times, but something always new comes out every time I say it. So that was just a thought that I was like, I feel like I have a script for this, but I'm excited to see what comes up. So, I actually never wanted to be a therapist, meaning my interest in psychology, human behavior really started from a place of like a more critical view of like what is wrong with us. So in high school, I was really interested in subjects like history and biology and the arts, definitely. And I was not good at physics, but I loved the idea of physics. And I just kind of was thinking about like what makes us who we are. So I actually went to go study cognitive science because I wanted to understand how we think, how we process things. And I actually went to a path of, I got a really cool job right after my undergrad, which was to teach teenagers documentary filmmaking. And I got really interested in documentary filmmaking when I was in college. And I found it like one avenue, even though I was studying cognitive science and psychology, I kind of found that way of exploring people and narratives way more fascinating. And of course, touched on my visual interest or like visual language. And so in that work, I worked at a public access station teaching young people this art form and exploring themselves through their own, like turning the camera on themselves, towards their communities, towards things that they're interested in. And in those 2.5 years, I also had started my own therapy for the first time. And I was also researching at a lab, and I was like, I think I am interested more in going deeper in understanding how narratives help people heal. So I think it was, even though I kind of have this like cynical, like I never wanted to help people kind of attitude. I mean, I did. I just wasn't thinking that was like my route into understanding humans was like the helping. I think two things. I was like, documentary filmmaking doesn't feel like the most stable career. But I felt like pursuing psychology and clinical psychology was a way of continuing to, deepen my interest in understanding people, understanding human behavior, understanding psyche, and a good benefit, a good, like what is it called? A good side benefit was that you could help people too. So that was my path. And of course, as a clinical psychologist, we are training, we have a different placement every year. We're in our grad program. And I really found myself drawn to, the severe end of suffering, severe mental illness, working in inpatient settings, working with trauma. And I think there was a side of me that I was like, okay, I know how to be here with this experience of others. And that sort of really helped me understand my own interest and my own strengths. And yeah, I think I did my postdoc at a place that was focused on severe mental illness, but COVID struck right in the middle of that. And when everything went virtual, things shifted again for me. Um, and while I still want to kind of go back to my work on inpatient and working on the more, I guess, a certain time in people's journey in their own understanding of their mental health, I was excited to come back and work at a treatment center because it was one of the first places that was really open to being in person again. And I was really struggling with the virtual therapy and doing, trauma therapy virtually. I was really struggling with that. So that's how I landed at the treatment center that we met at, is because it was back in person at a time where it still felt like you weren't supposed to. So I don't know, like that's sort of my path to where we met. And I think for me, and I'm now, licensed and have my private practice, but I think part of this work, I've always been intrigued by the multifaceted nature of it. So not just working in one-on-one individual psychotherapy, but group therapy, family therapy, and the somatic interventions that the treatment center offered for the young people that were there.
Well, I like that you were interested if you would surprise yourself in this intro. And I'm curious, the part that lights up for me as you were speaking there, and maybe it's a little bit of fresh ground, or maybe you've traversed it, is this idea that healing is a byproduct of something else, or that it came out, it wasn't necessarily the first drive, but that you found that a certain way of exploring led to healing, or a certain process was beneficial, and you could be there, you could own that ground.
Yeah.
Or help share the ground.
Yeah. And I think it's funny because I think that's not a new thought, but I think me leading with that is a new way. I mean, I think whatever is bringing us to this space, it feels more and more important to me that wasn't the drive, that there was, and I think there's something about that sticks with me for the folks that I'm working with, is that curiosity is the drive and feeling better is the outcome.
I think that's so important, yes. There was a training I did with an EMDR person who's quite high profile, that I felt like you couldn't leave unless you were healed. There was almost a pressure to be healed in the space. And in some ways that was very useful, but it felt a little aggressive and too much to me. And I think for certain creative spirits, they don't want to feel that they're being forced into a framework, even if it is with the intention of healing. It's still unpleasant to be worked on in a way that the person's taking it as a job and taking it very seriously and isn't flexible and open and having fun.
Mm-hmm.
I think,
and I think...
Sorry, you go for it.
No, you go ahead.
Of all the therapists I've worked with, I think what defines you in my mind is that you're having fun. And I don't think you can fake that. There's a level of play, a level of openness to exploration that I saw. We shared groups together a lot, and I saw the teens really responding to that invitation to play and the invitation to go off script. Sometimes you would even allow the clients to be the therapist, and you would sit as a client, and you would do all kinds of fun social experiment type things with the clients, and that really enlivened things. And I think that type of spirit leads to surprising outcomes, whereas when you're on script, I think it often dead ends, or people can sense what you're up to, and then they construct their defenses against that.
Yeah, I mean, I'm not this very rebellious person, but I have always had trouble like coloring within the lines. Like that's quite physically, quite literally, like didn't know how to do that very well as a kid.
Like literally coloring in, you struggled?
Yeah, literally staying in the lines. I struggled. And a big other thing was like drawing on the walls, like just like any surface, like whether it's a table or a wall. I was just talking to my mom about this yesterday, because my brother was very shy, and my nephew is very similar to my brother, and he has a younger sister. So my niece, who's very kind of outgoing, and I asked my mom, like, what was like, how did I show up to preschool or pre-K? And she's like, you immediately just like took markers and started scribbling everywhere, just like there to engage, which I definitely feel that spirit. It's fun. It's interesting how through your lifetime that sometimes gets constrained. But that's one of my joys of working with younger people. It's like, I also have permission to be that way. I have permission to meet them where they're at in the like coloring outside the lines without going too far off the page. I know now not to color on the walls, but I can still kind of like stick on the page and do things that are outside of the bounds, as long as it's, continuing to be safe in some form of container. So yeah, I think that is very much, and then sometimes sometimes it's hard because I'm like, well, I do want something neat, or I want something clean or well organized or well thought out. But I think this period of my career and life being around so many teenagers is, yeah, you kind of have to, immerse in that messiness a little bit.
Yeah, things have to break apart and get messy so they can come back together in a more complex, sophisticated, bigger way, right? The first order we have is too limiting.
Yes, exactly. I mean, that's what I'm saying. Like, I think as a teenager, I remember in dialectical behavior therapy, there's this concept of like healthy rebellion. And that form of rebellion and being a little contra is very important for that development, to figure out your own, whether it's morality or values or whatever it might be. I think in some ways I didn't do enough of that as a teenager. So now as an adult, I can feel, I have the safe bounds. I have maybe the judgment that helps me not be to model a sense of like, don't go too far, don't hurt yourself or hurt other people, but a little bit of kind of zest,
yes,
a little bit of like bitterness, or a little kind of flavor that is unsavory is okay.
I think therapists should be gangsters. I think there's a craving for it. There's, Alan Watts called it the element of irreducible rascality.
Rascality?
Yeah, rascality. So
like a rascal.
Yeah, and he even
okay.
He would link it to the Yetzer Hara in Jewish mysticism, this spirit of evil that's sown into humans, that we have a spirit of good and a spirit of evil, and that they both balance each other. And I think there's a craving for that that's not met in other forums, as you're, in education and in your job and in kind of the regular society. There's a factory model mentality that gets oppressive, and we need somewhere to see, that accepts the parts of us that can't fit into that factory model. I think, particularly with teens, their light is getting dimmed by the most of what they're receiving, right? And so you're the one place where they can finally be rebellious.
Yeah, I love that element of irreducible rascality. Was that right?
That's what he called it, yeah.
Yeah.
And I think he modeled that.
And there is,
maybe to a fault.
Yeah. Right. Right. And Rascal has this way of like um not being of like a mischief that is still ultimately pro-social, right? There isn't, I don't know, Rascal doesn't have this antisocial connotation, at least for me. There's a little bit of pushing, testing, but in a way that can ruffle some feathers, but not totally be destructive.
Yeah, I think that part of you becomes constructive and a team member the more you invite it and the more you accept it. When you push it down and you shame it, then it starts to want to break things. But when it's part of the family, part of the group, then it wants to contribute. I have a slogan actually. When I became a therapist, this slogan was in my head probably more than anything else. And it is, the more abnormal I make my normal life, the less I need to escape it. So I think making your life more complex, more expressive, more interesting means that you don't have to have underground escapes.
Yeah, I mean it's sort of the sad thing of like what has normal become, right? Like why does normal feel oppressive in some way?
Yeah, why? Yeah. Break it down.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh, me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Break it down.
Well, yeah, what does normal mean? Is normal a troublesome concept?
Yeah. Well, and I think that's the normal has to shift with the tides, right? Like there is no, I mean, I think that's what probably every generation of therapists or every generation of people that are working so closely with like human experience, probably that concept shifts so much, right? Like the idiosyncratic, it kind of dissolves. I trip up over that word a lot. Like it's hard for me to say normal, even though it rolls off like we all want to feel normal, and I always have to like wait, what is that normalcy? Because we get to have this like really amazing privilege of like recognize, you see these patterns, but each person has these like really incredible abnormalities, and it can be very I guess the thing is like normal needs to be disconnected or disassociated with good. I think that's the thing. Like what is, or what the trend is not what it should be necessarily, or what gets praised.
Yeah, I think normal means safe. In a herd of zebras, they have the black and white stripes and they all look identical, and they're trying to fit in so that the predator doesn't separate them out, and they're a danger for being unique. And I think a similar thing happens where we're trying to be the norm, we're trying to be the average so that we don't get attacked in some way.
Right. Safe, kind of, you have there's a restricted range, but that means for like, you'll only be in a certain range of experience, and that's fine. Like that is a certain way to live your life, but
seems to work for some people. Point, I could never make that work.
Yeah. And I don't even know, like I think about this, like, sometimes when I get in my very like, do I really, because we never actually know what another person's experience of the world is. We can come close to it, but we don't actually know. I think about kind of like, how do people live that don't have like an examined life in some way? Like, what are they thinking about? Like, what's going on? Well, I think right now in my life, I'm surrounded by people that are really, I mean, it's funny, maybe not, well, my family too, but I'm surrounded by people that feel committed to um, self-understanding, self-awareness, but I imagine there's a lot of people that may not be engaging in that type of process, and I kind of go between, well, how liberating would that be, but also how restricting would that be, but also like I can't even fathom that, because I think from like as long as I can remember, I was so internal in a way, so thinking about my experience all the time.
Yeah, but both of us know from working with clients, and maybe you can tell me your experience of this, but when you lift the hood and you get under there, no one is as simple as their public persona.
Sure. Right.
Yeah, and so those people that are living the unexamined life, they must have intimations of some of what's going on that's more complex than their simple model.
Oh, for sure. Yeah, yes, there is definitely so much there. I'm thinking about the people that don't access it, or don't want to access it, or have trouble accessing it. Um,
Yeah, I've heard this referred to as pre-psychological. And there's a theory that if you go back enough generations, you hit a psychological divide where there was not space to talk about emotions, and there was not, fences. Boundaries meant fences, and hello meant hello. There was no space for that extra layer of vulnerability, of complexity, of having mixed feelings about things. And then that we've created more space now. Every generation we create a little bit more space for emotionality. Like if you think about your grandparents or great grandparents and how much they could articulate about themselves. Have you noticed this in your lineage, that more is able to be said each generation?
yes, I mean, I think so. I'm holding that I didn't have a lot of opportunities to talk to my grandparents, but, so that kind of came up. But I also know in my lineage there is a lot of maybe what would be described as mental illness, whether it was diagnosed or not. Um, but
But two,
yeah,
three
I
generations.
think I guess what I'm my thought about that is, I think it was, I wonder how much the differentiation is about private and public, though, which is there was this, I mean, we think about like, yeah, like people have been thinking about themselves and humanity forever, right? We have these, I don't think it was just the philosophers and the psychologists and the spiritual leaders that were thinking about this. People were thinking about this. And I do feel like there were private spaces to do so. It just wasn't, yeah, I guess vulnerability means shared. So how much publicly was it happening? And by public, I mean with your spouse, with your family, with your parents. Like, that's public enough. And of course, now we've gone to a realm of public that is kind of really wild and still feels unfathomable to me.
With social media?
With social media, yeah. And just like what, how people talk. Yeah, I'm just having this moment of like, wow, like thinking about my great grandparents that I didn't even know, who maybe couldn't even say I'm feeling sad, to the TikToks that are overusing the word trauma, Like that's not even that much time.
If you go back far enough to make the point a little bit even further, and if you go back to, say, the Middle Ages, and what's in my mind is Carl Jung being asked about his parents and him brushing off the question, and in a documentary, and he said, well, they were basically living the same way that was handed down to them from the Middle Ages, and they were living as very simple village people in the same set of instructions that had been handed down and handed down and handed down, and so they couldn't understand huge aspects of Carl Jung, his parents. At age 11, he felt that his father could no longer understand him. He had birthed something in his own mind that he could see his father hadn't, some level of self-awareness. And so when we think about that Middle Ages way of being, you basically had to be religious. If we think about Europe, I guess this is Eurocentric. If you had to be religious, you couldn't stand up against that, and there was a very strong dominance hierarchy, and people thought of themselves as subjects of the king, subjects of the church, and individuation wasn't really possible. And then we started the Reformation and the Renaissance. We opened up space for expression that was at variance to religious texts. But so I think we've had quite a rigid model of thinking 5, 6, 7, 8 generations back. And if you look at the bigger picture, it's a kind of recent phenomena, this idea that you could individuate and become something true to yourself as opposed to what was expected of you.
Right. This is making me think back to the range of normal, right? And what is now acceptable. And I'm still thinking about those, like Carl Jung's parents and grandparents who had this prescription. But I still like to believe that, like, it's not that they weren't having these idiosyncratic experiences of wanting more bizarre thoughts or things that were not publicly permitted. But that's where this is where the oppression, the addiction, like things that are trying to, like, where the shame takes over and might lead to a disease, might lead to like affliction or addiction of some sort, because there isn't room for it, right? Kind of what we're seeing still today. We have or let's just also say in maybe my sociocultural like bubble, because I am in a bit of a bubble. I don't, and I could say that the permission to be abnormal is, I have larger bandwidth, but that's definitely in my kind of social circles, right? Socioeconomic status, where I live in the United States, like, all these things make a difference in how you are able to, like what permissions you have, I suppose. But I think that's where it's like there was this restricted range, but it's not that people weren't having these desires, or I think you and I have talked about this, of just like this wacky internal world. It just didn't have a space to go. And then it makes me wonder too, like, these theories on language. If you don't have the language, how much is your thought restricted, right? Like, so if you don't have words for some of these experiences, how much does that limit your ability to experience them? Which is probably part of our evolution as communities or societies, or if just even biologically. I'm sure there's some difference in how our brain or, neural plasticity has evolved over the years. But I'm like thinking about that. That's like what makes me feel so like, well, I don't actually want to have this sort of bias that life was any worse than, of course, like, because there might have been a way of dealing and containing with it that felt satisfying and that felt complete in some way. But I am thinking about all the folks that maybe like, that really suffered in their kind of privacy and how else it got, where did those impulses get channeled into that might have been harmful to themselves or other people.
Yeah, I think there's prehistory and then there's ancient history. Or there's modern industrialized culture, I think, was a time of great suffering. If you were off script, you were a heretic or a lunatic. But then further back, I think there had to have been times where we were in harmony with nature. Maybe it's nostalgic thinking, but I mean, if you just take us back to when we were part of the animal kingdom, we had to have felt a sense of unbroken connection with nature at some point.
And, I'm glad you kind of pointed out the Eurocentric piece, because I think, this is always a realm of continued exploration and recognizing my own hesitation. But I think Hinduism at its core is very much about duality. A lot of the deities were always gender ambiguous, and very much about coexisting in the world. And I think I'm glad that was a really important point, in ancient history and where some of these philosophies and spiritual traditions were birthed was very much about harmony and expression and the complexity of just being. And then, it's sometimes unfathomable to think how did that start to get so constricted? Because Hinduism today is very, as all kind of major religions have been used to really control and limit the expressions of people. But I think all religions at their mystical, spiritual level are all about, something that is non-dual.
Yes, it seems like we're moving culturally in a pantheistic direction. As we recognize more complexity, Hinduism seems to be reflecting how the mind works in many ways. I think it is resonating more and more for people from other cultures,
I think a lot of I think Hinduism was one of the major world religions, but I think so many of our indigenous spiritual traditions have so many overlapping themes.
Yeah, I want to get back to what you said about ancient people probably had rich private lives that just weren't capable of being shared.
Or that post-ancient.
Post-ancient.
Whatever.
Okay, so
industrial
people,
they
couldn't speak it, but they had these rich inner lives. And I'm on your side. I want them to have that. But I'm also wondering, when I've been in my own therapy, speaking it and having it accepted is very different to having weird parts of yourself that have never been spoken. So I think the speaking of it is so much of the juice, the bringing it to the surface, having it witnessed. Yeah, and so if there's outsider art that never ever reaches the outside world. People who basically never release their work into the world and it comes out later. To me, that always seems, it's hard for me to recognize the value of it, or I struggle with it a little bit. To me, art is about a relationship to an audience of some kind. It feels sad to me when it doesn't reach the audience.
I was just having this discussion with a patient, actually, who was struggling with this. He felt as if it was too much, too self-serving, that he wanted attention and affirmation from his art, from his creative process. And, where did we get this idea that there's, this prototype, I guess, or not prototype, archetype of the artist who doesn't care what other people think, right? I know there's an element of that, but this idea of an audience, of a relationship, of a conversation with expression is so fundamental. And that, I guess that's what I was saying. I think there was this experience that was happening, but it didn't have any integration, because, you know, if you aren't allowing it to have some outlet, then, you know, how much does that restrict your range, right? Like, it's sort of just like, you know, if you think about it for language development, right? If you, you know, how much harder it gets to learn a different language as you get out of that zone of development for it, or even just like how language development also just like, you know, it's so important to help at that zone for kids to learn how to speak, because then it becomes harder and harder. I think what you're saying is, yeah, what I meant is like, there is this experience, but naming it or understanding it or expanding it or integrating it, to a higher experience, probably there wasn't permission unless people had their ways of doing it. And then I can also think that the art that isn't made, that doesn't have an audience, maybe the art itself is what the conversation is with, right? So I have this image of someone of that time, this like Middle Ages, of like having this bizarre and wonderful inner life, and them finding like a way to express it with the art, and that's the conversation, right?
With themselves.
That piece of that, yeah, with themselves.
Yeah, and I guess journaling is another example of this. So if you keep tending to it, if you keep watering that garden, it could keep growing and expanding and becoming more and more elaborate, even without anyone else seeing it. Yeah.
That's sort of where, I mean, I think creativity is at such a core of our healing and of our expansiveness, is a creative process of some type, whatever that creativity looks like, is, you know, it doesn't have to be seen, but it does have to be like, there does have to be a process with it. And then I think maybe you, because you are an artist, and for me, someone who wanted to be an artist, and and there's a way I'm an artist, but I wanted to be an artist as my profession, stopped that, because there is, like, I think in order to like pursue that career, again, these are limiting words, but it does require an audience. I didn't want to make films that no one would see, you know? I think that was, I knew that this was fun, and, you know, I wanted to do that, but I didn't want to just produce these things and have them go nowhere. And that was a big piece of why I loved doing my work at a public access station, because all of the documentaries that these kids made would be shown on the public access channel, right? And who knows who was actually watching that, but someone might have flipped through it, you know, people that don't have cable, and there's somewhere that it gets to have an audience. And I think that is an important piece for the pursuit of so I guess that's why I'm making this difference between like creative impulse and creative expression as a form of healing, and as a form of promoting the space for your wacky world to come out, versus kind of pursuing this mission as an artist, which I think does have inherent to it like an audience or conversation with the outside world.
Yeah, I think I have a personal bias from my own experiences in this realm, where I was working for about 3 years on art that wasn't really making it into the world, and I could sense I could just go deeper and deeper and deeper and be okay with that, and I was vibing, I was enjoying it, but it wasn't gonna work out. It was feeling somewhat delusional. And maybe I was trying to catch the wave a bit too deep to make it out. And I sensed an avoidance in it for myself. So for my own process, I could sense my ability to stay with it in a way that would keep developing, but never get outside feedback and never be tested as a contribution to the community. And it was a way of staying small, of hiding, essentially. And so I think we need feedback loops to grow and to develop. And having the pain of your work meeting the world and learning from that encounter is a growth in my perspective. And so I think not doing that is an avoidance. And I also think, the feedback process helps to helps to provide an external stimulation into your process. That the dialectic is what leads to something that's valuable. It's very hard to do that on an island. That creative communities tend to produce genius, not lone geniuses. And so so I favor a creative model where you do get to market, where you do get feedback. What did Steve Jobs say? True artistship. That shipping is part of being a member of a community. That you also, as an artist, you're serving a role to the community. You're surfacing information that people are not incorporating or aware of. You're helping them to see something. So if you're not shipping, you're doing this work that's not benefiting those others that don't have the time to be doing this. Maybe they're raising families. They need you to show them something.
Yeah, I think that concept of like frustration or pain, that comes with the feedback loop, right? It's not like, for you, what you're saying is that when you were in your deep process and practice an artist and recognizing you weren't going to it wasn't going somewhere that you wanted to, still required you putting it out there, right? Still required you having attempting to have some conversation with it.
Are you saying before, are you saying when I was working that I was in some way still putting my work into the world?
Yes.
How? Yeah, I'm not sure I follow.
No, meaning like you're saying that even the feedback loop, even when it is not reaching, like the not reaching is also an important piece of that feedback loop, right? If you're not, I guess I just be like curious about the frustration of recognizing it wasn't going anywhere. To recognize it wasn't going anywhere meant that you were brave enough or something enough to have to deal with that like reality.
Yeah, I think there were symptoms that pointed to the fact that something wasn't working. I was having financial insecurities and anxieties that were disrupting my creative process. I would have a spin out every month. And then in my relationship, it was, the financial aspects of our life was coming up a lot and causing relationship conflict. So it wasn't working. And I could just bury myself in my art and tune out the symptoms. And I think what you're saying is there was some feedback in that I myself was evaluating the work and then making changes and developing it. And there was an internal feedback process. But that was too safe. That was avoiding other important information that was in the world. And then eventually I gave up on the whole thing because I guess I sort of put it on a shelf to be incorporated. I every now and then I'll reach up and pull something from that shelf, but it's no longer it's no longer sitting on the desk and as my main activity. And that's actually serving me better, right? That was, I incorporated some painful reality to adjust my course so that the art could serve my life more, and I wasn't just sacrificing myself for this artistic process that was destroying me.
And that's what I mean is that it's not the art that wasn't reaching, that what didn't have something to say. It was the conversation with yourself and with like the art making process that led to like revelations and realities of, wait, this, I have to shift into a different direction. And I think for an artist, as you said, you're always coming back to it, right? It's taking a different form. And I know this kind of brief, like your illustrations have now hit me, like whatever brought you to the place of like your artistry has now resonated in a different way with a person, but you have to get on that path, a different path to have, right? I'm taking me in as example, but like there's so many other people, right? I've saved your slides. They're being, it's now out in the world again, but it's being used in a totally different way than you maybe had imagined then.
I appreciate that. Yeah, I think I faced a lot of hard truth and oriented more to what people needed and adapted my art form, allowed my art form to become more flexible and more adaptive to fit the need to be more of a conversation between me and the world. Whereas earlier my art form was a conversation between me and myself away from the world.
Yeah.
And don't you feel that that's even most artists that ready make it do that because they need the information from the world that actually is informative, right?
Yeah. Do you watch The Bear at all?
I have not.
So have you heard about it?
Yeah, the kitchen show.
Yes. Yes. Anyways, the season, forever is what maybe some people might be. Episode 1 of the latest season is this very beautiful meditative view of this really talented chef's mind and his I have a lot of interpretations of it, but there's just he's in this process, like how he became who he is because there was a conversation with the world that informed his practice as a chef, but because of these causes and conditions that constrict, he quite literally like sort of freezes himself out from the conversation of the outside world. And I think like I wonder, I haven't seen it, but just like what are the consequences of feeling this need to become obsessive in your practice, with instead of like thinking that this the need to shut out the outside world is sort of this, like, I think coming from a place of trauma, right? That you need to make your world small again to focus on what you know and what you and your control over your practice. And of course that's gonna really confront a very limited life in some way. And I was actually having this conversation with a friend this weekend, like, geniuses are born out of communities. But is there a level of like inherent dissatisfaction with someone who is perceived as a genius in their creative practice? Because you have to always, it can never be enough or good.
Yes, I think the geniuses tend to have that quality of never enough, or a really big superego, a really big manager in IFS, a part of them that just relentlessly tells them to do better, right? So you have done a 7-day silent retreat. So to me, that's an example of deepening the conversation with yourself, understanding yourself better, taking yourself offline, out of the social contract. And so I guess you have some information on what can be gained from that type of thing, where we do spend more time by ourselves to deepen, and that might impact the way we then return. Yeah, so I'm just curious, anything about that experience that enriches this conversation?
Yeah, I mean, I think that was a truly life-changing experience, and not in this very like, oh, I was someone then and now I'm someone now, not this like pre-post type of thing. Rather, I've been in a kind of a weird state of grief ever since the silent retreat. That I am craving that time again. And that like even when I was there, it was so interesting. My room, we obviously we had a chance to move into our rooms and meet the person we were cohabitating with before intentionally setting our silent. And my roommate was a Chinese American woman whose father is also Buddhist, and we were talking about the concept of retreat, that it's such a Western thing to go on retreat, to sort of like have this space that is so outside to have this time to go inside, right? You need to like go to a place, for me, like in Northern California, a little off the grid, where you have to turn in your cell phones, like take time off work, whatever, to really have this experience of being with oneself and being with one's mind. And, for her, she was talking about her dad, like, there's a daily practice of there is that embodied and part of everyday life. It's not this thing that you have to retreat to. And while I kind of see the benefit of intentional retreat, this idea that we've come to a place in our society or life that we can't kind of achieve that without this kind of extreme version of it. And because I mean, maybe where I am in my process is like, that was I really miss whatever that experience was. And even my early mornings and my time with myself and my meditation, there is something that is like so different about not having to not having to come back to check my phone or something like that, something so small like that, to look at who the next email or text was from, or and so that's all to say, I think it's a bit rambling, just that how did we get to a place where, first of all, when I've told patients or friends that I've done that they're like, what? That seems so crazy to do that. It's like, it's really not. It's actually like, once you get there, you're going to want to be there more. It's just, we've come to a place where that kind of inner place with oneself has become somehow so scary, right? When I think it's actually quite, I think once people experience that, it's so powerful. I think more of because I had this, I mean, they even said they're like, don't go up signing to be part of a monastery now, like slow your roll, like when you come back, let yourself integrate slowly. But I was one of those people that was like, I think this is it for me, then I think I should just be a monk. And I knew that, like, maybe not yet, that's not where I'm at in my life right now. But even when I think about, I'd like to make this a yearly tradition to go, it feels hard. Like there's something still funky about like, how do I integrate this idea of protectiveness, of silence in my own life right now, rather than, retreat in this way. And I think most likely I will go do it again, but I think that's where I'm wondering about retreat with oneself that isn't avoidance, rather that's a very like sacred and space, just like space and expansiveness. But I think that's where the collective piece matters so much. It's like, I need others to be on board. I think that was what was so powerful about the retreat, is there is a shared intention of that. And so you are internal, but not alone at all.
Yeah, and that's different to a hermit going to Alaska and living in a cave and we never hear from them again. Right.
Or a microcosm of how that looks like here is like just, not just choosing to stay in every day or something, right? Like just wanting to retreat from social life. Like there's something that feels reactionary versus just more intentional. Like, could we all just share that for a moment? Could we have a day where it was just like everyone, like, I just had this like fantasy of like, what if one of our days off was actually a day of silence and remembrance for whatever you're honoring, but part of that day is about moving through your holiday in a way that we share this intention. And that's why I love religious traditions that kind of have those shared, like Shabbat, for example. I think that's such a powerful thing. And in Hinduism, there's like these days of fasting that you do on the new moon, that you have this collective that's sharing that together, but it's your own internal relationship to it.
Yeah, and so the intentionality really matters. I think that changes it from an avoidance to something you're using for growth. And yeah, I in my words, I see the personality as largely a collection of protective defenses that are glued together by anxiety that many people occupy as their identity, as their sense of themselves. And in a retreat like that, you're testing when I go beneath that. So I'm not needing to maintain that social front. Can I rest in what's deeper? And the protective layer for a lot of people tells them it's dangerous below here. Don't let go. Don't, hold on tightly, and your anxiety keeps you alive. Don't ever test what's below. And you actually did the test. Can I be with myself for a long stretch of time? Is there a resting place there? So yeah, I think that I respect that. I think you're developing an identity that's below the constructed identities in a sense. And then you can choose those when you need them. You can choose them in society, but for a lot of people, they've never tested that. So there's a little bit of a white knuckle quality to their identity.
And I think there's right now in my process, I'm not in an integrated place yet. I think I feel it like I'm either below, like meaning in that place of with myself and who I am without social interaction, and the who I am with others and the world and the performance. And I think what I mean by like the grieving is like I right now I'm not sure how those two things two sides of me are. I mean, obviously they're coexisting. I'm living both parts, but I feel more split. I feel more sacrifice. Like I've sacrificed that part of me to be here, and the kind of social. And I think there were some periods of loneliness, deep loneliness in that 7 days, and like wanting to reach out and connect and smile or laugh with someone. And there feels right now to me sort of this like choosing one or the other right now.
Interesting. Well, when you drop below that protective layer to the core, maybe you discovered, some ancient sadness, things that had been there, before your awareness, that, some inherited, some from early childhood, but that you re-owned aspects of yourself that hadn't been given enough space yet to be owned.
Yeah. Yeah, I think I'm still very much on my journey with understanding that. Um, yeah, and it's a very, I think even though I can talk about, inherited, ancient, intergenerational, there still feels something so like these are all cognitive for me still.
Interesting.
I get it and I know it's there, but I think because I have had such a disconnect with lineage, like I don't feel it. I don't feel that yet.
What's the sadness is you feeling something that probably
Sure.
relates.
Definitely. I think the world, like this feeling like you're cut off from tradition or lineage or something is definitely a piece of what contributes to loneliness. As it's always so interesting what comes back around. In this conversation, just the surprising appearance of Hinduism, right? It's not something I think about often, Hinduism, and it's here. And I know that is very much part of my, on both sides, very religious and spiritual grandparents above. And that was lost. Only my parents sort of, but definitely lost with me. I guess not lost, found, or is being discovered again, but through a different framework. But I'm like, there's both this ache and repulsion in a way, or attraction repulsion of wanting to like learn more and dive deep into that lineage.
Yeah, and you have to own it to heal it. So you're still in the process of discovering what's there, deepening, and yeah, it makes sense. There would be aversion and attraction. And I just want to quickly hit, I know we just have a minute here, but it seems like the polar opposite that you do comedy, stand-up comedy, is almost the opposite of this silent retreat aspect of you, or maybe they relate in some way, but it's a very public-facing place where there's lots of feedback, right?
Yeah, and I think I just am such a fan and admirer of the art form, and that's why I tried it, because I think again this is all about, I love art. I think all art is about like just taking different perspectives, but I love to laugh, and I think like the idea of turning something so dark and painful into something funny was just like that's alchemy right there, right? And I think, yeah, along with curiosity as one of my drives, it's like absurdity is the other one. Like things are just so funny, like when you think about it. And I don't know if that just comes like how that for me to think things are funny, I had to out of an environment that allowed to think that, right? So so that's where like the relational world comes in, like something contributed to a sense of humor, right? I don't think, this would be an interesting developmental study, like how is a sense of humor born, or like what are the ways that someone is allowed or given permission to laugh. Feels like you had to have a safe enough environment, although I listen to a lot of podcasts interviewing comedians, they've all had so much like very significant trauma, so it's where did that flexibility like come into play. But yeah, I think the kind of absurd and I was laughing a lot on my silent retreat, right? But that was probably there's just like a lot of things that were funny memories, or just things that I was even witnessing. Like there was a lot of absurd in my silence. And I think that the relational, like, yes, the art form of stand-up is like wanting to share that. But I think, and I will continue to like be part of that community in a way that maybe helps other people write, or I love doing that kind of work. I don't feel like I need to perform, but that's absolutely one of my way, like kind of, I think like there's like creativity, absurdity, and physical movement are like my medicine. Those are like the things that can get me, that will loosen things up for me.
Beautiful. Let's end on this image of you laughing on your silent retreat. I'm imagining I'm imagining you by a stream.
It's birds. Birds make me
Birds.
lost.
I'm imagining a great big Ram Dass belly laugh, surrounded by nature.
I would love that. That will be for my next one. These were smirks and laughs, but I will hold that belly laugh image. Oh wait, no, I did have that. I had that on my hike. I had that on one of my solo hikes of like, I started to remix certain songs in my head, and one of the funniest remixes that came into my head was Let It Be and Who Let the Dogs Out. And it was just like this really, I was like cracking myself up that these, like, I don't think I'd heard those songs in my recent, like before that retreat. And then I started like having this like DJ remix of those two songs. And I was just, yes. So you can, the sonic and visual stimulus we can end on.
Incredible. That'll stay with me.
All right, Stephen, thank you so much for this.
Thank you. Great. Cheers.